The Boy from Yesterday. Before we get to Chapter 16, The Horseshoe, I just want to remind everyone to please leave a rating for this podcast and a review and help to spread the word and subscribe, because we want to share this story with as many people as possible across the world who might appreciate hearing what the story has to say. So thanks for taking a minute to do that and for subscribing, and I'll look forward to seeing your reviews online. Chapter 16, The Horseshoe. For a farm boy from 1890, Tom was remarkably composed, efficient, and almost eloquent in his own way in explaining to Laurel the circumstances of how he arrived 130 years in the future through a magic ring given to him by a mysterious showman who sympathized with Tom's desperation to help a sick friend. Laurel was enraptured by his demeanor, which was equal parts hesitant and charming, but also sincere, with a glint of boyish youthfulness in his eye and in his voice. He spoke English fine, but once in a while Laurel's ear sort of missed what he had said. She wasn't sure if she hadn't heard him correctly, or whether he was using words she didn't know. And for being the same age as Laurel, there were a lot of words she didn't know. He talked more like she remembered her grandfather talking, certain turns of phrase, and she was fascinated by these old-fashioned phrases like her grandfather's, but coming out of the mouth of someone who she could be at school with. As time passed during Tom's explanations of all he had been through in the time just before he met Laurel at the fairgrounds, Laurel herself didn't even notice that she went from skeptical crossed arms and crossed legs to sitting up with her elbows on her knees, chin resting on her hand, as her skepticism began to melt away. It's not that she was gullible, but it was because Tom's story was just like a credible witness in a jury trial, consistent, detailed, even impassioned. She had few questions because Tom was smart enough to anticipate most of them. No, he didn't know much about Zeller. No, he didn't know anyone else who knew anything about Zeller or the ring. No, Zeller didn't say how the ring worked, he just sort of hinted at it, now that Tom thought about it, with a few references, almost puns, about time. No, he really wasn't told what to look for. Yes, he felt overwhelmed by what he saw. Yes, he was scared. No, he didn't have any way of communicating with anyone in the past. So focused was Tom on explaining the basics to Laurel in the hopes that she would just relax and believe him, so she could somehow help him learn something or bring back something to help Sam, that he didn't even bother to ask about the world Laurel lived in, or even what had been happening in the world in the many years that Tom traveled, whirling through some kind of time portal he could barely describe, the memory a bit fuzzy from the bump on his head. Twice, Laurel had to tell Tom to stay put in the barn while she went inside to throw Marguerite off the scent of trouble, when Marguerite had asked why Laurel had been spending so much time in the barn apartment. Laurel made up an excuse that sometimes she liked to study in there, which was true, and that she was also revisiting the idea of moving into the barn apartment and its bedroom and bath to give her a sense of more privacy and independence. Marguerite had agreed to this months ago, and even had Clark Angus do most of the work to build it with materials from his hardware store. Marguerite had thought it a lark to have part of her ancient barn from the 19th century be converted into a sort of guest house, a feature of luxury that she had read all the homes in Hollywood had. Several neighbors around town had historical homes with barns on the property adjacent to the house, and they had already done the same thing, but Marguerite wanted a nicer design than all of them. Laurel also just went inside to use the bathroom because even though the corner of the barn, which was the new guest house style bedroom bath, she didn't want to use that one because it was very quiet in the barn and she didn't want Tom to hear her pee. Laurel thought about this a second, and it occurred to her that she was being particularly shy, but that already Tom's Victorian manners were rubbing off on her. She was already embarrassed that Tom thought she was a hooker, all right, dance hall girl, she corrected herself, because of what she wore for clothes and was wearing makeup. While Laurel thought Tom was cute, to say the least, he also appeared a little uptight to her, but then she corrected herself again and realized that, despite Tom looking only his stated age of 19, Laurel did the math and realized that if Tom was telling the truth, he would now be, in essence, 150 years old. As she realized this, coming downstairs with her purse and heading back outside as Marguerite was at her computer making notes of something, which could be anything from recipes to more genealogy research. She paused a second at the foot of the stairs, hesitating before she went back outside. Her heart leapt a bit at the thought of it. Was she really talking to a man who was 150 years old? How could that possibly jibe with the beautiful young farm boy who told her the most amazing story with sincerity, wonder, and an almost pleading panic in his eyes when talking about a sick friend who was lying in bed, possibly dying, but that bed was in a room in a house 130 years ago. Laurel realized she had to stall. There was no way this was all going to be resolved right away. There was always the possibility that Tom actually was drunk or hungover, a teenager from Chesterfield Day. But Laurel was smart, and she knew it. She liked to think that if Tom really were playing some prank, she would have known by now. He would have slipped up. Something wouldn't sound right. And he certainly wouldn't have had the almost annoyingly impeccable manners Tom had. Only someone who had been raised with manners, including possibly Victorian manners, could have acted or talked that way. The realization of this made her heart beat faster, because if Tom was telling the truth, and every minute she spent with him convinced her more and more, then she would be in a real situation. She would feel compelled to help him, that was just Laurel's nature, and helping him would seem impossible, not the least of which because it would mean, first, realizing that magic was real, which was overwhelming in and of itself, and second, what to do now that the world's first known time traveler was sitting in her barn. The whole idea scared her and made her wonder why she was the one to have to face this. Laurel felt sorry for Tom's plight, because the way Tom choked up a little when talking about Sam made her tear up as well. Tom tried to be so masculine and so stoic, but he was either the best actor a town like Chesterfield had ever seen, which was unlikely, or he was telling the truth. His fear and concern that Sam was dying in a bed 130 years ago while Tom was on some kind of intergalactic joyride through time itself upset Tom. His voice even cracked when Tom said something like that, although he didn't call it an intergalactic joyride. That was just how Laurel heard it in her mind. And it was that crack of desperation in his voice that made Laurel determined to help Tom. The question was how. But since she had the home turf advantage of living in the present day, and Tom was the fish out of water from another century, not to mention her house guest, she felt the burden rested with her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to help this Sam, who, if Tom was any indication, was probably a decent guy in his own right. To believe him, she needed one more push, one more thing to put her healthy 21st century skepticism at rest, which wouldn't have been much comfort, she thought, because nothing would provoke her anxiety more than to realize, without doubt, that she was really dealing with a time-traveling farm boy from the Victorian era, and couldn't tell a soul. Laurel knew that if word ever got out of Tom's arrival in the present day, even in a small college town like Chesterfield, it would only be hours or minutes on social media before hordes of news crews, documentarians, scientists, Nobel Prize seekers, tabloid journalists, government officials, military operations, dangerous paranoiacs, and geeks of all types obsessed with time travel would descend upon that town like never before, making it a chaotic mess of a hot news tourist destination for curiosity seekers in no time. But that wasn't the part that bothered her. The real worry was that if the secret of Tom's confirmed time travel got out, the hordes of people, including government and military officials who had the power to incarcerate or sequester Tom O for his own protection, would have delayed Tom and distracted him from his mission, which was to learn or obtain whatever he could from this modern time that Zeller had hinted at, and get home, somehow, by using the ring and to save Sam from a likely demise, which could alter the course of time forever. Laurel recognized from her pre-med classes that what Tom described. Sam had some kind of severe infection in his leg, probably sepsis. She also knew from biology class that germ theory was really in its infancy in the 1800s, and antibiotics such as penicillin were not invented until much later. As Tom spoke, she Googled penicillin on her iPhone and learned it was discovered by Jonas Salk in 1923, long after the time Tom came from. Of course, that led to a half-hour digression about what a smartphone was. Meanwhile, Tom had his own rapid thought process occurring. He listened to Laurel's description of the smartphone, and Tom noticed and appreciated that she explained it sincerely, not laughing or suspecting Tom of a ruse. Tom nodded and tried to listen hard, to learn and understand what she was saying, but many of the words she used made no sense to him. The only thing he really understood was that the little glass card she held in her hand that had an electric light inside was somehow a modern-day telephone, but that's as far as he got. Tom had had a telephone at the general store, but he and Uncle Nate certainly didn't use it much, as it was very expensive to make a call. Only certain wealthy customers paid to use it, and even that was rare. A small number of neighbors in some buildings on the campus had electric lights, but he and Sam had just been talking recently about how at nighttime anymore you could see more and more of them downtown. He and Sam had talked just the other day about how times were changing fast, even then, so in a sense Tom wasn't surprised that things had changed that much in Chesterfield. Tom thought a second about that, how it felt like recently, but he realized that where he was now, and when he was now in the 21st century, that the conversation he had with Sam about time changing was actually long, long ago. In some ways he was surprised that the town hadn't changed as much as he would have expected. Even in the barn apartment, Tom was still aware that it was his barn, and somehow that made it be more comfortable to be in. Tom, surprisingly, was fascinated but not overwhelmed by the idea that Laurel's modern version of a telephone that lit up in her hand was apparently developed to have many functions. He understood the general concept that somehow telegraph wires had increasingly become telephone wires, and even those were somehow made invisible, and that electric lights had somehow been made small enough to fit into little snuff-box-looking things. But what he didn't understand was how one could type something on a little window and have the window print it, and then answer back like some kind of a book that could talk back to you. That was magic too sophisticated even for Zeller, Tom thought. The sheer number of odd verbs that Laurel tried to explain was mind-boggling. Googling, texting, and what was emailing? Did she mean Ema Ling, some kind of Chinese inventor of the device? Emily texted Laurel at one point with the ringtone sound alerting Laurel to the incoming text, and it startled Tom, who wasn't used to electronic sounds. Tom had only heard music at a concert hall or when someone was playing an instrument in their parlor, a big instrument, or on a phonograph he once saw when he made a delivery to Minerva Butt's house from the general store. How a band, a musical instrument, or an entire phonograph cylinder could fit inside Laurel's pocket amazed him. He had thoughts that apparently Zeller and his ilk of magicians had apparently found a way to take over the world and make everything in it function like the automatons and trick machines that Tom had seen at Zeller's workshop. With each question from Tom, Laurel explained as best she could, and while she spoke, the look in Tom's eyes, the way they would glaze over, staring as wide as saucers, and the way his mouth would sort of hang open as he listened to her every word, continued to convince Laurel that this was not just some kind of hungover kid playing some elaborate practical joke. After a couple of hours of conversation, which went by fast, Laurel knew this was something more. Still, she had gone through too much to risk being seen as gullible. Her worldliness for such a young age was something that Emily admired in her, and perhaps was even a little jealous of. It was what attracted Christian to Laurel, Emily thought. Laurel had traveled some, mostly with her parents, especially when her parents were involved in some pursuit of higher education. But all that stopped when her mom got sick, and she hadn't left Chesterfield in a while. But she knew enough to want to be convinced, just a little bit more. "Tom," Laurel started, "I hear you, I really do. But it's just, if I'm going to help you, I have to make sure this isn't a parlor game?" Tom asked. Laurel didn't quite know what that was, but she agreed anyway. "Yes, that's exactly it. A parlor game." Tom looked around the barn. "I think," Tom started, then stopped, looking around to make sure, then nodding and smiling. "I think, or rather I'm sure, that this barn is my barn. I lived here, well, in this house, and we had this barn. This is where I'm from. This is my home, or it used to be, back where I come from." Laurel gave him a look. "Really?" This barn is 130 years old? Oh, it's older than that if you mean where or when I come from. Uncle Nate built it after the old one burned down, and he had almost had it done, too, and was going to put a new weather vane on top of it, when somehow he dropped it from the roof up on the ladder, and then the E broke off. He put it up anyway because he said he could still use it, and that's how I recognized it when I first came here, through that, well, however it was I came here. Tom paused as Laurel looked around the barn, seeing it in a way she never seen it before. The boards did look old, but lots of wood looked like that. She noticed how dark and rusty some of the nails were, and she noticed a few boards here and there that didn't match the others, like they had been replaced, some quite recently, by Clark, after various animals or bugs had gotten in. Laurel thought for a moment how long ago yesterday felt, before Chesterfield Day, before seeing Christian, before the festivities, and certainly before this, meeting Tom, which already had changed her life and the day wasn't over yet. Tom looked around the room, excited and inspired by something. Then his eyes rested on a spot just above the doorway. "Yes, that's it! Proof!" Tom suddenly exclaimed. You want proof? I got it. You see that board over the doorway, up yonder there, the dark one?" "Yeah," Laurel said. "What about it?" "My horseshoe is back there. I put up a horseshoe back there for luck, over that doorway, when I was helping Uncle Nate build the barn. He never knew. I just hid it up there and boarded it up. And I put my initials on it with my whittling knife. TJF. You can see." Laurel got up and approached the doorway, but it was too high. She got a step stool and started to climb it, but Tom rushed in. Oh, no, miss. Allow me." Still with the miss, Laurel thought, by the way, Tom did so instinctively showed her that he was not like other guys she knew. Certainly not Christian. Tom stepped up and used his unusual strength to pull the old wooden barn off with a crack. He reached inside the hollow, which was dusty, and blew the dust away as he pulled out a deeply rusted object, which Laurel saw, sure enough, was a horseshoe. Tom climbed down the little step stool, wiped off the horseshoe's dust with his left hand, then licked his right thumb and wiped away a spot on the back of it, and presented it gallantly to Laurel, who took it with both hands. She looked down at the filthy horseshoe and tilted it back and forth in her hands so that it would catch the light. She squinted at the small letters etched inside the rusty, gritty horseshoe and saw TJF 1888. Laurel turned a little pale as she looked up at Tom and took a deep breath. She was more than a little skeptical before, but that all melted away. She looked at him clearly, seeing him in a whole new light. They both stared at each other for a silent moment. Tom smiled faintly and gave Laurel a little nod. She nodded back slowly, still staring, and her throat gave a gulp. She took a deep breath, still staring in disbelief, that what was quickly turning into a panicked sense of belief. She nodded a bit, then finally spoke. "We gotta get you some new clothes."